All right. So, once again, I am Asha Nayaswami, and we are doing the Bhagavad Gita. We are still in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. You may notice the background has changed. I was 3 months almost in Ananda village, and now I'm back in Ananda, Palo Alto. Those of you who watch this years from now, it won't make any difference, but that's what we've done. That's why the picture's changed. So last week, at the end of it, I was dealing with chapter 2, stanza number 56, which I dealt with to a certain extent, but I want to go back for just a part of it, because there's a very important phrase there that I touched in the last 5 minutes, but I feel like it needs a little more attention than I gave it. Number 256, which I read last time and I'm reading again. He whose consciousness is unshaken by affliction and is not excited by good fortune. I think I dealt with that extensively. But then there's this phrase, who no longer hungers for earthly affection. And then it goes on, and is without fear and anger. Such a man qualifies to be considered a Muni of steady discrimination. That phrase, who no longer hungers for earthly affection, I did touch it last week, but I really felt that it deserves really careful consideration, because it's there's two sides to it, and it's a very complicated story. Just not very long ago, I was in conversation with a married couple, friends of mine, and he was commenting about the fact that once you're married, your karma, you're mixed. Your karma is mixed. You don't have the simplicity of the karma of just one person. You have the karma of two people that you have to work out. A woman friend of mine who had lived a very nun-like existence, a very pure and lovely soul. I mean, I'm talking 30 years ago. She just had this wonderful, extremely simple life, very, very spiritually focused. Then she married. She married a man who is an equal partner to her, and they've had a very fine life together. The wonderfulness about Ananda is that there's room for both monastic and householder life without there being any diminution of dedication. So they're exemplary householders in every spiritual sense. At the same time, soon after she got married, I was visiting with her, and she'd been married probably less than a year. And she had this thought in her mind that just as soon as she got things organized, she would get back to the simplicity of the life she had before. I said, give it up. There's just no way. Once you make an alliance with someone, what you're aligning yourself with is that their karma becomes your karma. And now, for a person with a monastic inclination, that's not always the good news. And this is what I was saying to my friend much more recently. Again, sort of just talking out, wanting to be able to go forward in this very orderly way. But that very orderly way is not at all the lifestyle, life attitude, way of functioning in the world of the woman he shares his life with. And it's like you can't have it both ways. Now, so the monastic ideal is that, well, you just repudiate it. And the Gita goes a step farther and says the man of established wisdom doesn't even long for that. There's no desire for that companionship. I'm going to ask my techie person for a moment. The light disappeared on the webcam.
Yeah, there's some issue. I'm restarting again.
Okay, shall I pause?
As soon as he makes me presenter again.
So did we have sound, or shall I just stop?
It's patchy.
Okay. The point of doing it is to do it, not just to do it.
Can you try again, Asha?
Okay, the light's on again. We're going to try again. Okay, we had a brief technical interruption, but now we're going on. I'm not quite sure where it broke, but I'll just continue. Uh, so my friend was talking about the dilemma. Oh, I was starting to say, so the monastic ideal, and even what the Gita says here, is that we simply repudiate that we establish a life in which we are alone with God, which is a wonderful ideal. But here's how he describes it, that no longer hungers for earthly affection. Well, that's not something you can fake. And that's not something that you can just impose upon your heart if your heart is not inclined that way. And in the Holy Science by Sri Yukteswar, and I have to preface this remark by saying that is not a book that I have studied or in any way feel qualified to present. But there was one concept that I drew from that book, which I believe I remember at least in its essence accurately, which speaks right to this issue. And Sri Yukteswar was talking about, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. This is what Jesus says in the Bible, and in the Holy Science Masters, Sri Yukteswar is comparing aspects of the Christian teaching of Jesus' teaching and the traditional teaching of India. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I mean, that's quite a statement. Purity of heart is a principle that carries through all true religious traditions, because purity of heart means, okay, let's start with the word purity. Purity means that there are no blemishes on the natural state. And we don't have to create something that doesn't exist in order to be in tune with God. We just have to remove from our consciousness those things which obscure our nature. If you talk about our true divine nature as being a lump of gold, you can put that gold and bury it in the ground for as much time as you want. You can put it deep in the ground. You can surround it with clay and mud and all sorts of things. Eventually, when you pull it out of there and wash it, the gold is untouched by all that corruption that has surrounded it. And so it is our own nature. Purity of heart is our natural state, but we become enamored of things that are not really natural to us from the divine point of view, and then that obscures it. And so spirituality is just to eliminate all those false desires. And this is what this Gita verse is talking about: unshaken by affliction, not excited by good fortune, and no longer hungers for earthly affection. So Sri Yukteswar, in dealing with the idea of how do we purify the heart, if I remember it correctly and understand it correctly, I believe he talked about like the 5 stages of purifying the heart. But the first 3 of those 5, or at least the first 2, I believe it's the first 3, all demand that we be in intimate interaction with the world and with other people. Because we're obscure to ourselves. It's just, it's marvelous how Maya mixes up our own minds and makes us unaware of our actual motivations and the actual nature of our character. And the way our character is revealed to us is by the interaction that we have with events and with other people. Again, to go back to here, unshaken by affliction, not excited by good fortune. Well, you could say, I'm not both of those things, but merely to say it is not the same as to be in a state of affliction and then find out whether I'm unshaken by affliction. And also to build one's capacity to hold fast to a spiritual ideal, no matter what threatens our equanimity. And so we both, our character is both revealed to us and our character is developed by that interaction. So when Sri Yukteswar is talking about these stages, he goes through 1, 2, 3 stages in which, and the word he uses is, we are compelled into relationship. And he doesn't just mean intimate marital relationships, but that's part of it. We're compelled to get married. We're compelled to raise children. We're compelled to live in society. We're compelled to be part of communities, in intentional or otherwise. Our karma forces us to, because otherwise we would never have the opportunity for self-discovery and self-development. And only after we've reached a much more elevated state where our self-honesty is so highly developed and our self-awareness is so highly developed that we can work on our own without being forced by circumstances to confront our limitations. So even though the Bhagavad Gita says, the man of wisdom no longer hungers after earthly affection, that doesn't mean that the hunger for earthly affection is not God-inspired. It's God-inspired not because God wants us all to be married and have families, but it's God-inspired because at a certain state of spiritual development, there is no way to advance beyond that state without the necessity for interaction. And so we have to be very, and this is what I mentioned last week when I just used the phrase, we have to be very realistic about ourselves. We have to, the thing about the spiritual path is every aspect of it is true. The highest dimension is true for us, but we have to take things, we have to wear the part of it that fits us. Master said, you only have to do, is it 1% of what he said? For a long time I said it was 10%, but then I think somebody told me it was only 1% of what Master taught in order to make enormous spiritual practice, but everybody takes a different 1%. And so that's why he has to give such a broad-based reality. This particular issue of the hunger for human affection, a very good friend of mine, with whom I started on the spiritual path some 40 years ago, this man has since gone, many other directions, but he tried to impose upon himself spiritual ideas that were more elevated than his actual consciousness, and actually created a kind of craziness for himself by trying to live according to this, well, if the man of settled wisdom, no longer desires this and this, then I repudiate them also. Had sufficient willpower to maintain that for a while, but then the whole thing just blows up from underneath, because suppression is not the same as transcendence. And self-control is not the same as suppression. It's a very, very delicate balance here. And it was very interesting because many years later, he and I just sort of talked about this, and he quoted to me some very specific instructions that we'd both heard of Master's teachings and things Swami said. And I said, you took that seriously? That was my response. I said, it never crossed my mind that teaching applied to me. Just like so didn't cross my mind. I just knew that there was no hope for me to try to live at that level of discipline. It just simply wasn't who I am. And as a consequence, I had the rocky path of whatever I had the rocky path of, but so did he. We just did it from different ends. So the art of the spiritual path, and that's what I'm really talking about. When Swamiji put all of his lessons in Raja Yoga into one book, he called it The Art and Science of Raja Yoga. It's amazing how little things can be. You can focus in on the smallest points, and there's often so much depth behind those small parts. Just that phrase, art and science. Because Raja Yoga is a science. We are made a certain way. Sooner or later, we have to stop hungering for human affection, because that hunger for human affection, I was listening to Swami talk about it recently, is really the longing for God. And we have to understand that the comfort and the union that we seek will never be found except with God. But we have to learn that by experience. And we learn that, interestingly, it's not by having our desires disappointed. We imagine that being disappointed is what moves us forward on the spiritual path. Actually, it's being fulfilled that moves us forward. Because if we're disappointed, there's always a part of us that thinks, if I could just have that, then I would have a satisfaction that I crave. But when it's fulfilled, then we realize much about life is really beautiful and satisfying, but even satisfaction without God is not the final satisfaction. And Master himself said, human love perfectly expressed is almost the same as divine love. I thought that was such a sweet way to put it. In the wedding vow, it says, may our love grow stronger, ever more pure, until our love for one another becomes the perfect love of God. Because we learn how to love. We learn how to love in our everyday circumstances, and then that gives us the capacity to love that is really grounded in self-sacrifice, in a way that God requires of us, but that until we reach a certain stage of purity requires interaction. So anyway, I felt that was a really important part to put forward here. That doesn't mean anything specific, because self-realization is not a dogma. That's the difficulty of it. I mean, Swami Kriyananda, Master himself, in this age, Master was dedicated to creating intentional spiritual communities where not only monks and nuns, which has been the tradition for all these centuries of Kali Yuga, but married couples with families where children could be raised, and people did not have to give up their dedication to God. But that dedication could be expressed through that way of life. And so Swamiji himself actually been married for a time to help us understand how human love can become divine love. At the same time, the Gita is also true, because that hunger for earthly affection causes us at times to not hear the more subtle voice of God, because desire obscures our attunement. But desire obscures our attunement, and we just have to keep living through these things until it's all settled. Anyway, so that's what I had to say about that, and I didn't feel like I gave it enough. So now I want to go to number 257. He who, under all circumstances, is without attachment and is neither elated by goodness nor depressed by evil is a man of established wisdom. The phrase that really stands out to me is not depressed by evil in this one. And when I read this, I thought how profoundly timely this is, and how since we have chosen to incarnate in a transition between yugas, we are in Dwapara Yuga rising, and as an overall flow of energy, the consciousness of the planet is elevating. And that's why, as I was saying a moment ago, at this time Master came and is able to seriously propose that a person can be a householder and live a householder's life and be engaged with the world and not diminish his commitment to God. Even this very idea has to come in a higher age, because in the lower ages, the gap between ordinary life and spiritual life is so great. That's where all the traditions of cloistered monasteries and desert fathers and Himalayan yogis come from. It's all from Kali Yuga, when especially Kali Yuga descending, where everything is just getting darker and more confused. There's no point and trying to establish a spiritual work, because at the nadir of Kali Yuga, the barbarians just sweep through and destroy everything. And it was the isolated monasteries and the isolated yogis that kept the flame of self-realization intact, so that when Kali Yuga began to rise, those truths would not be lost. But now where we are is Dwapara Yuga proper, the age of energy, began in 1900, and the transition into it began in 1700. So we've been in it for a while, but it's a 2,400-year period of time, leading into Treta, which is 3,600 years. So it's not like tomorrow we're going to be there. It's also true, and this is depressing, that war, according to the tradition, war continues all the way through Treta Yuga, which is even the yuga beyond Dwapara. And so if the consciousness of the planet is such that entities can still go to war with each other, we're not talking about a golden age, because the very capacity to go to war implies so many selfish misunderstandings. In Satya Yuga, war ceases to exist. Now, in higher ages, I believe in Treta Yuga, not so much in Dwapara Yuga, war may be more controlled, soldier to soldier. Dwapara Yuga, according to Master, and all of this is my just telling you what those I believe who know are saying, Dwapara Yuga is a terribly insecure age, because there is a tremendous advance in technology, which is what we've seen, which also includes negative advances in technology, atom bombs and drones that can bomb, and all the different ways. I mean, I don't have to enumerate it all for you. It's all pretty grim, and you all know it. And so there's all this technological capacity to do evil, but moral development has not advanced to the point where mankind as a whole knows not to do that. And because the technology is so advanced, there's no place that's safe, because any place can be targeted. And, you have the GPS system. Any place can be targeted, and any individual can be targeted. We're seeing just the beginning of it. And from one point of view, it's positive because it contains the violence. From another point of view, in the wrong hands, it's genuinely terrifying. And where we are now in this transition it's a very dynamic stage, because there's a tremendous amount of enlightened thinking going on. Just today, this is a very small thing, but I'm old enough now to have watched how this developed. A friend of mine took me, after taking me out to lunch, she took me to a little sort of, it looks kind of like an ice cream bar. It's a combination of a juice company, I don't know the name of it. It's a juice company, fresh, organic juices, and then something that's like ice cream. But the ice cream is made, I think it's even made without sugar. It's just made differently, completely, with just a few whole ingredients and so on like that. No, it was very nice, because you kind of get the joy of chocolate without the after effects. It was great. But what was so interesting to me, it's a tremendously popular store. I've seen lines, straightening out a block in a very high-end shopping center. And in 1967, when I became a vegetarian, it was completely unheard of. When I became interested in organic whole foods, it was completely unheard of. It's just like nobody was thinking like that. We were so far on the lunatic fringe. And everything that we wanted, I had to make myself. Recently not recently, but a few years ago, I sort of went back just for fun. You bake your own bread, you make your own granola. We made our own ice cream, and we did everything. But now you could just walk down the street and buy just as good as what we could make. We made it ourselves, partly on principle, but we also made it ourselves because nobody was selling it. It was just out of the question. And what has happened that is now, even today I actually felt bad in the grocery store, because there's this very good brand of milk that's been there for a long time, and they're trying so hard to get onto the wave. We don't use growth hormones, we don't do this, but for one reason or another, they can't put the word organic on their milk. So I bought the other brand because it was marked organic. And, I actually felt sorry for that company, because it's just the world has moved away from them. And are they going to be able to stay in business unless they convert? Now, all of that is to say it's not small, because it's indicative of the fact that consciousness is changing. 50 years, I'm talking approximately. That consciousness is really shifting into a much finer, more sensitive reality. And yoga, meditation, all kinds of things, mindfulness, it's all over the place. I've lived long enough, as I've said, to see it. Simultaneously, wow, I never read the news anymore. I really try very hard never to read the news. Every once in a while, I will look at something, and everything is just, one thing is more depressing than the next. I live in the United States, and the United States is going through a cycle of change, disrespect, strange bedfellows, just a very odd period of American history that we're living through now. And the temptation to be, let me see what we're not supposed to be, depressed by evil is almost irresistible. There's been a few developments in the United States of extraordinarily insensitive treatment of other people, moving into war crimes kind of things, although it hasn't gone that far. And I can hardly bear to think of it. I really have to just take it out of my mind, because people are being hurt in ways that at least wasn't common in our country. To not be depressed by that is very, very difficult. So here I am. I've been on the spiritual path for decades. I can articulate all these points of view, very well. And it's not that I should be insensitive to people's sufferings, but the idea that God is really in charge, and that I can simultaneously feel great compassion and pray for people and wish for their suffering to stop, but not allow the fact of evil to pull my consciousness down. Because that's what this is saying. It says, is neither elated by goodness nor depressed by evil. And at first one thinks, how could that even be good? How could it even be good that you don't rejoice at goodness and despair over evil? It doesn't even feel like a spiritual attitude to feel that way. So you have to go way, way deep into the overall philosophy to really understand. Recently, and unfortunately I can't quite remember the context in which this quotation from Bapuji was offered. Bapuji being the one of our Himalayan masters, the deathless guru. And the essence of the statement was, it's sort of like, Bapuji, why don't you stop? Why don't you stop these bad things from happening? See, that's what the heart wants. The heart wants it to match my idea of how it's supposed to be. And the heart also wants not to have to be witness, even witness by just seeing the news, to so much human suffering. We want the suffering to stop. In the tradition of the caste system, not the caste system as a social medium as we think of it now when we think of the caste system, and then we immediately think of India. The ideal of the caste system, the 4 basic castes, has nothing to do with the social external world. It's a very clear and extremely useful progression of consciousness within each individual. It's available in many other Ananda resources, but I will say it extremely briefly here for the point I want to make. The first caste is the Shudra caste, which is considered to be peasant, is how it's characterized. By what that means is a person who is uncreative, who only acts at the threat of punishment, and generally speaking is limited to being able to work with his physical body. Now, there's still many Shudras who are not actually just working with their physical bodies, but they're entirely selfish. The principle being, how do I avoid suffering, and what is it that gives me happiness? In the first caste, the Shudra level, how I avoid suffering is by going unconscious. And how I find happiness is by ease, just complete ease. And by not putting, the less energy I put out, the better I feel. So I watch television, I drink beer, I overeat, I eat lots of meat, I eat lots of ice cream, I eat lots of sugar, maybe I take drugs. I just dull my awareness. I do as little as I possibly can get away with doing. And that's what the Shudra consciousness is. The second caste, which is really why I'm bringing this up, is the Vaishya. And the Vaishya is considered to be the merchant. And of course, what that represents, what merchants represent is, I will definitely give you something as long as you give me fair value in return. So the Vaishya is always calculating. You know, what am I getting? Am I getting back what I'm giving? And if nobody's going to give it to me, then why would I give it to them? And the way the Vaishya experiences happiness is to have his own desires fulfilled. And the way the Vaishya deals with suffering is to control the environment around me. So a Vaishya becomes rich, and he's willing to put out energy. In fact, he's willing to be very creative and energetic as long as there's something in it for me. And so what happens is, if the thought form is that I have to control my environment or else I suffer, I am subject to the world around me, then we have to make the world match whatever it is we need in order to feel secure. So what happens from the Vaishya level, and this always makes people very mad, but it's just a fact. What happens from the Vaishya level is you need to make the world be a certain way, or else we're afraid. So we have to eliminate poverty, we have to eliminate war, we have to eliminate all kinds of human suffering, which God knows that's a good idea. I mean, we want that to happen. But this quote from Bapuji was, Bapuji, why don't you stop this? And Bapuji's response was that he can't really do anything about the evil in the world. All he can do is add more light. Because evil people are also children of God. And they also are on a trajectory of a necessary learning process in order to come to their next level of understanding. And what's even more disconcerting, really, for the spiritual person is Master said, all of us have to go through all the stages. And if we have learned any lesson, if we know that a certain behavior is not going to be happiness producing, the reason we know it is we know it from our actual experience, which is a really challenging teaching. A tremendous number of these teachings are just, there's no comfort for a lazy mind in this. You have to just keep pushing against these points until they become so clear to you that they actually have power. Until then, we just have to keep experimenting until we learn. It's not enough for the Gita to say you have to stop hungering for human affection. You have to really understand from your own heart why that is a positive state and not just a state of absolute deprivation. So what happens in an age like we're in, where Dwapara, where Kali is transitioning into Dwapara, is that, the light is increasing, but there's also a tremendous amount of darkness. And because there's things are shifting, the darkness is fighting back, fighting back with tremendous intensity to hold on to what it has. And individuals who are not in tune with where the energy is going, are desperately working. And there's this, the way Swami said it is Like a planet has a certain, at each stage of the yugas, a planet has a predetermined balance of light and darkness. And no matter how hard we try, except by being in a higher age, in this age there's going to be this light and darkness. And it may be a very important karmic step for us to take on these causes and try to, make the world a better place. But at a certain point, a different realization comes to us, which is one, I'm never going to make myself safe by just controlling my external environment, because my external environment is beyond my control. I finally get a few evil people taken care of, and then something else happens over here. Or the earth itself sends a hurricane or a flood or a famine or a drought. And, it's endless. And we become very, very depressed. But we're happy when something good happens, and then we're really depressed over here. And what eventually happens as we progress through the caste system is we move out of the second caste, the Vaishya caste, because no matter how hard we try to control our environment, one, we're never able to. And two, we get tired of suffering. We get tired of being subject to constant suffering because the world refuses to cooperate with our idea of what it should be. We're elated by goodness and we're depressed by evil constantly. And if we're truth seekers, there's so many different images I can pull in here. Our festival of light, you enter the third stage of the soul's journey, and that stage is called the quest. And instead of trying to impose our ideas, self-evidently, my job is to get rid of evil in the world and to make this world what I think it should be, we enter the stage called the quest, and we begin, instead of to impose our self-evident ideas on the world, we actually begin to ask in a more subtle way, what is really happening here? And that's the shift from the second to the third caste. And the third caste is Kshatriya. Kshatriya is ideally the soldier king. And what that represents is the king is the servant of the people. His whole life is a sacrifice to serve his people. The soldier is the ultimate discipline sacrifice. The soldier, trains himself at great discipline cost to give up his life for a cause he believes in. It's living now not for my pleasure and my comfort, but I'm living for my ideals. And I'm so dedicated to my ideals that I'm willing to sacrifice everything up to and including my life for those ideals. And that's what a soldier represents, and ideally a king represents. Almost all our rulers at this point are Vaishyas. Some of them are even Shudras. Very few of them are actually Kshatriyas, which is, of course, a whole lot of the problem on the planet. Now, when we get to the Kshatriya level, our joy comes from living up to our ideals. And the way we try to alleviate our suffering is by self-control and by disciplining the inner world. So we recognize, and it comes by intuition. It doesn't come by anybody telling you. If you go and try to convince social activists, people whose karma appropriately puts them in that place, this is the same conversation about the hunger for earthly affection, we have to live through those stages that are appropriate for whatever it is that we need to learn next. If you go to social activists and tell them the balance of light and darkness in the world is always going to be the same, you should give it up, they're not going to hear that in the way you mean it until they themselves have begun to experience that. And above all, what they have begun to experience is, I keep suffering no matter how much I try to control the world. I need to find another way to live because the suffering becomes unbearable. We only change when the present situation becomes unbearable. That's Divine Mother's way of doing it. But when the thought comes to mind that what I really need to control is the inner universe, we just begin to work very differently with the world around us. And this is where we're no longer elated by goodness nor depressed by evil, because we recognize this is the way the world is. This is early Dwapara. I mean, it's a little mantra that I use. It's kind of a joke, but when I see some of the conditions that are in place in this world, and even more seriously, see some of the implications of where this planet might be going, it's not a happy prospect. So one has to ask oneself, is anybody in charge? Other questions start coming in. Is there a greater reality? Is there a cosmic intelligence? Is there a loving divine mother? Are any of the promises of the scriptures true? Or are we really just abandoned down here and it's all up to us? The history of Ananda as a community in relation to other communities that have founded, Ananda often, even though, the community's movement is not as big in energy as it was in the 60s and 70s, when, especially in the 70s and into the 80s, when we were starting the community at the village and this community in Palo Alto. It's kind of taken a little back seat to other considerations. But people had this idea that we'll get a piece of land and we'll all live together, and we'll make our decisions together, and we'll grow our own food, and all problems will be solved. But most of those communities don't exist anymore. Or they've really become something that they didn't set out to be. Ananda is one of the most notable successes from the last 40 and 50 years of this effort. But even during the time when people were interested, Ananda rarely got the attention that its success warranted. For several reasons. One was we were perceived as sectarian because we followed one spiritual path. But the other one was because nobody really wanted success at the price they felt we had to pay. Because what many of them were thinking is, we can make this world match our desires. We can create an environment that we can control that will be, well, the phrase Swami always used, it was heaven on earth. We can create heaven on earth. Whereas the teaching of self-realization is you have to transcend the things of earth in order to experience the bliss of heaven. That doesn't necessarily mean, as I was saying at the beginning, that you have to be a renunciate living in the cave. But you have to give up the idea that if I can just control my environment, then I will be happy. And you have to realize that God will send me whatever He's going to send me, and the only aspect of it that I have control over is how I respond. I was amused that someone who came to our temple said, many different groups, he said, talk about giving up the ego. And then he said rather ruefully, but you people actually mean it. That's just, yeah, we actually mean it. We actually are not living on the Vaishya level. We're actually really seriously trying to live on the Kshatriya level. We're not a democracy. As a community, we've never been a democracy. And we're not a consensus community. Purushottama coined the phrase dharmocracy, which is actually a very good phrase. We are collectively committed to the principle of dharma. And we work together to understand what that dharma is. Of course, Paramahansa Yogananda, Swami Kriyananda, and Jyotish, Devi, others who have positions of leadership within our community help to bring clarity to that discussion about, in each circumstance, what dharma might be. But it's a collective attunement that we're working with. And we're not attuning ourselves to what I want. Democracy, 12 people want one thing and 10 want another, so the 12 get what they want. And democracy, as Swamiji said, is better than any other system that's possible at this particular stage of man's evolution. But sooner or later, people just vote their self-interest, which is the nightmare that we're seeing in the democracy of America right now, which is everybody's just voting their self-interest. And it's crazy. de Tocqueville, when he saw our country some hundreds of years ago, said the great failing of democracy is that pretty soon the elected officials realize they can bribe the people with the people's own money, which is you take it from them in taxes and then you give it back to them in benefits. And that's exactly what's happening. Everybody wants the government to take care of us, and everybody promises, but the government gets its money from us. So they're bribing us with our own money. It's crazy. But it's better than any other system. It's better than no regard for law or for human nature. But a higher system is attunement with true values. But you see, that's a Kshatriya way of thinking, which is that we recognize that there are ideals, and then we try to live by those ideals. But that takes a great deal of discipline. When we have a movie called Finding Happiness, which was a movie that we made about the Ananda community, it's available. You can rent it on the internet. And if you have never watched it, I highly recommend it. It contains, among other things, wonderful footage of Swami Kriyananda taken in the last year of his life. Footage which is a little different than what's mostly available. It's almost virtually everything available is Swami Kriyananda giving a talk. And in the movie Finding Happiness, it was somewhat staged, but you see Swami Kriyananda having conversations and interacting with people. And it's just a very nice other perspective to have, which those of us who lived with him, of course, saw all the time, but few of us had the wherewithal to film. There's a little bit of film like that, but not as much as it would have been nice if we'd made. But in one of the showings of that movie, someone was asking me a question, and I can't exactly remember the question at the moment, but the answer that I gave had to do with this, I think it had to do with whether or not a community has to have a spiritual basis, which is a serious question, because Ananda is trying to be an example of communities, and not all communities are going to want to be as dedicated to one path, or even to any path, as we are. So we always want to answer the question that you don't have to have a spiritual path. But the fact of the matter is, and this was what I was trying to say, people are extremely wedded to their likes and dislikes. Our likes and dislikes, that's the impurity of the heart, is that I want this and I don't want this. I feel my happiness will come from this and my sorrow will come from that. So I need to avoid this and have that. That's the Vaishya idea. I have to make my environment match my desires, and then I won't suffer. But the problem is that those likes and dislikes are very strong. And when you get a group of people together, 10 people or 150 people or 1,000 people, there has to be some, especially if you're really trying to accomplish something as a community, there has to be some overarching value that that gives enough energy back and is powerful enough that people will actually, that it's more important to them than their preferences. And of course, any transcendent ideal of God, by its very nature, is bigger than your egoic preferences. And so if you can have a shared spiritual understanding, then it helps discipline the ego. Otherwise, people will just take what they want. What's happening on our whole planet now, not just in the United States where I live, but happening on our whole planet is because atheism has gotten so far embedded into people's systems, thinking, and so far embedded into so many government systems, and embedded into the school systems and so on. So children are being raised this way. Because there's so much sectarian fighting, the way to deal with it in America is that we take all spiritual ideas out of the school because there's so much sectarian fighting. But as a result, education has become atheistic and entirely materialistic. So there's no inherent value that is more important than what I want. And so what has become the value of our country, and unfortunately we export a great deal of our attitude to the world is, if I can get it for myself, why wouldn't I take it? And if we're not if we're not one with a greater reality, and if we've given up the idea that there's an overarching infinite consciousness to which we attune and of which we are a part, then why wouldn't I just take it? And if we're thinking like Vaishyas, which the majority of the planet is, if I can get it for myself, that's fair. I'll just take it if I can, if I'm smart enough to get it. There was a cheating scandal in one of the local high schools here in Silicon Valley. I've mentioned this before because it's such an incredible example. These very, very, very smart, privileged children figured out how to break into the computer system and change their grades. Somebody told me recently that some of their parents actually helped them do it. But what happened then was, when it was exposed, people tried to impose a traditional sense of moral outrage onto the situation. But the children themselves were not influenced by that sense of moral outrage. And they simply argued back. No one has ever cared whether I'm learning anything, ever. All they want is that I get the right grade point so that I can get into the right college, so I can get the job and get the money. He said, so we found a more efficient way to get the grades. So what is the problem? And in honest fact, given the context, there really wasn't a good answer to that. It's just a means to an end anyway, and I'll just get it faster. Because if there's no moral compass, then there's nothing to stop us. So let me just sort of come back to the point where I was trying to find it. So we're living in an age both of rapidly expanding enlightenment and accelerating disintegration. And it's essential for those who are part of the rapidly expanding enlightenment that we maintain the right vibration in the midst of this. Because if we move over to the side of anger or despair or being depressed in the presence of evil, then what we are emanating is the same as what everything else that's going on. It's fear, it's sadness, it's worry about ourselves, it's self-concern, it's the environment has to be what I want or else I'm not going to be happy. We can comfort ourselves by saying we have better values, but the things that we are attached to don't define our values. What define our values, except very superficially, what define it is really the caste system. It's whether or not I understand that I am part of a greater reality and I'm here to live up to my ideals. You don't create peace by being angry. You don't create happiness by being afraid. You don't create joy by being selfish. And it's very complicated because we're not supposed to just passively sit back. We have to resist negativity and darkness, but we have to combat it with light. And the only way to combat it with light is if we have mastery only over our own fears. And this is where, under all circumstances, the man of wisdom is neither elated by goodness nor depressed by evil, because we understand that both light and darkness are a creation of God, and that everyone in creation is equally a child of God. And yes, those whose negative tendencies pose a threat to others need to be restrained. And at times, there's even such thing as righteous war. They may need to be eliminated. But how we do that and the attitude we have is what really determines what happens next. The way our consciousness determines the planet, that's really the primary force. And a lot of this negativity that we're seeing, the way Swami put it is, the earth is a living creature, is a living being. And for a very long time, we've been abusing the earth in countless ways, just losing connection with our relationship to the natural world. Nayaswami put it, the earth responds very slowly, but when the earth decides to respond, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. Whether it's weather patterns or terrible storms or volcanoes or earthquakes. So how we respond to that, I've had this experience. I don't consider myself to be a particularly courageous person, just generally speaking. But my spiritual beliefs at times make me calmer in certain circumstances. For example, I'm not as afraid of death as some people are because of my understanding of what that's about. And on a number of occasions, I've had to help people. I've been asked to help people who were about to make a transition. And often when people talk to me about somebody who's dying, I just say to them very simply, if somebody is dying and one person in the room is not afraid, I said it will change everything. And just in any circumstances, if one person even has the slightest bit of a capacity to see it from a divine perspective, it changes everything. Our little bits of consciousness just moving out, that's how the world is really changed. It's changed one by individuals coming to a higher state of enlightenment. And how one individual comes to a higher state and then radiates that understanding to another who then comes, that's how the world really changes. In my 50 years of being on a path of conscious awareness, I've seen the world change in astonishing ways. But it's all been through the individual awakening. And the more powerfully and consciously we can do that, the more dynamically the powers of light will be able to use us as instruments. Because you see, that's what it is. It's not my mind or your mind. It's that we attune ourselves. We attune ourselves to Bapuji. And then through us, he can't eliminate the darkness, but he can increase the light. And that's what our job is in this world now. God bless you.